Wait, simply
So,
wait.
okay. Like, wait, don't tell me. Okay, we're good.
Yes, yes.
So let me introduce you properly here. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is a podcast called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. It's on Substack and all those good places, and I will ask you to subscribe and do those things. Today, I am talking with someone who my producer, Ernie, I believe, met you a little while ago, Gene, somewhere, and heard you or saw you someplace. Is that correct?
Well, we just sort of met on as we started corresponding, but
Okay.
no, I just on spec sent my
Okay.
information
Okay.
to.
Because Ernie's into churchy things, being he's the husband of a pastor and describes himself as a pastor's wife, somewhat facetiously. But um, so the book was something that I don't know how it all came to his attention, or maybe you sent it to him or whatever, but it kind of is very much in my producer's neck of the woods because they're in a progressive church in a hotter part of the country that you don't want to live in because it starts off at 120 every morning and goes from there. But anyway, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Gene Waight. And Gene identifies as a scratch cook, canoe paddler. We see a canoe paddle behind you, recycled Christian and amateur sociologist. She is the author of, quote, The River Beyond the Dam, Shooting the Rapids of Progressive Christianity. And I'll do my housekeeping here. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack commentary page. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. So, Gene, this is really a pleasure. Now, I'm going to be talking to you about your book, and I have quotes that I pulled out from areas that I think will pull us into an interesting discussion. And I'm going to, first of all, describe the book a little bit. And I pulled this, I have read the book, and we're really going to get into it, but the description on Amazon isn't bad. Gene Waight is a memorist whose work has appeared in Cirque. I say it in French because I lived in Switzerland and speak French, a literary journal for the North Pacific Rim, and in the anthologies Memory into Memoir and This Uncommon Solitude. Her sociology master's research appeared in Research in Social Stratification and Mobility. She's worked in communications and community relations and lives among tall conifers in Bellingham, Washington. And I guess the description I'll start with here, and then we won't go into this whole thing off the page. A modern ex-Christian tree-hugging American woman comes up against a strange wish for church, but only if it could be radically different from what she's known. And that sort of gets us into it. So let me get to a passage from your book. And where did I grab this from? I think page 50. And I thought this would be a little personal road into our discussion of your most interesting book. And that is, here's the quote. Mom might have feared going against teachings, but she acted as though God is bigger than some of the things she learned in Bible study groups. Now it was my turn in life and my choice. I couldn't just forget my concerns about Christian teachings, nor keep them locked away for long if I were to continue with this attempt to be in church again. I was going to unpack them one by one. And if I was your publisher, I would have put that on the cover because I think, if I'm not wrong, that unpacking one by one really kind of talks about what your book does. It certainly struck me that way. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right, Frank.
Good. Well, we're on the same track then. So, what interested me about that quote, let me just go back to it here and I want to dissect it a little bit, was this idea that if I were to continue with this attempt to be in church again, I was going to unpack them one by one, them being the areas that seem very problematic when it comes to what the Bible actually says. And then the other thing that you bring out about your mother that I think is very true of so many people in so many areas of life, it kind of intimates that she was a better person than her theology. And she was looking for something that corresponded more to who she was at her core rather than a belief system cast in concrete that she had to follow, even when it went against what she intuitively felt to be true. And I think that's a big stream in your book as well.
Well, and in your accounts too, Frank, that I've read about your
Mm.
mother.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I'll go to one area. I mean, since you've mentioned my mom, I'm always interested when I compare the official teaching that they did subscribe to, unlike you, who have somewhat veiled from that and looked from a different kind of a church. There were things about their beliefs, my parents' beliefs, and their ministry of L'Abri Fellowship that could have been described back in the day in, say, the 1960s and 70s, when I became very conscious of what was being taught there because I was a teenager. That would be described as fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, period. Um, but if you had actually been in the community, you would have thought a lot of the time that you were kind of in a very freewheeling hippie commune up in the Swiss Alps that had very few rules and regulations, in which, for instance, gay people were accepted and cared for without any kind of preaching at them and felt very welcome. And it was a complete contradiction in terms. And the way my parents dealt with it was kind of weird in that there were certain things they just didn't talk about anymore, but never came out and said, we've changed our minds. And so let's start with the areas that you changed your mind in and your kind of personal journey, of which this book is a narrative. And then I'm going to dive back into some quotes. So if you sat down on a plane next to me and we had 30 minutes on a commuter flight, and I said, hey, you got a new book out, tell me what it's about. Let's start with something straightforward like that.
All right. Well, something that's very dear to my heart and was like number one on my list that you cross this line and I'm out is 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 Christianity necessarily patriarchal?
Yeah.
Is it truly from the start male centered, or were changes layered on afterwards? And that's one thing I found out, that it wasn't like that at the start.
Mm.
Women spoke equally, but some voices did get um, just buried. And one of them being there's a small reference to Junia. Uh,
Mm.
she was listed by the Apostle Paul as another apostle
Yeah.
teaching, accepted in leadership, and how that fact, and it became an all-male club, the
Hmm.
apostles, how that fact got buried and was thought to be, well, just this doesn't even make sense. There are no women, that we don't need their voices. And
Yeah.
so they changed the name in some translations to a male sounding name. And
Mm.
that is just was a great find for me, that
Mm.
that you know what, there are some voices missing here, and there is another kind of Christianity that was there in the beginning before all the struggles and tussles happened over power.
Yeah, I don't know what your view on this is, and I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to get into this, but it always brings up a question with me, and that was, how trustworthy is the 400 years that it took to put together the canon of what's included in scripture, in the sense that it just seems that that occurred in a period of time when the biblical teaching, was very much being made to conform to traditions that predate the scripture, such as the patriarchal societies out of which these scriptures were coming, the way women were treated in the Roman Empire, in Judaism, and so forth. It's a big struggle for me because I always feel that people want to go back and reread history to fit what they hope is true. And of course, my debate with a lot of my progressive Christian friends, people I've interviewed on this program, by the way, many, you mentioned McLaren and others, all of these folks I've had on, everybody you talk about in your book or quote who's alive and has anything to do with these issues, I've talked to pretty recently in this podcast. But my kind of quibble that I'm going to bring up with you right from the start, just because I think it's an interesting discussion, is I feel that progressive Christianity, for which your book, by the way, is a very good advertisement, and I mean that as a compliment, has a real fallacy there, and that is sometimes is unwilling to look hard enough at the facts of both church history and the text, in the same way that certain feminists go back into history and try to find the one woman who was an accepted painted in the 16th century. And it's not good enough to just find her. Now she has to be as important as, you know, a male artist of a comparable period of history, because we want to elevate the people who have been crushed. And that's a good instinct. But I wonder, you know, whether in looking at the basic thesis of your book, you don't feel that sometimes we look for things because we want Christianity, we want to hold on to some part of it. The most typical example is the kind of progressive people who sift through the teachings of the Apostle Paul, or what was edited to become the Apostle Paul's teachings, sort through things that sort of help them make him look a little less of a patriarchal menace. And then we really don't talk about the other stuff. And the same things with the verses in the Bible that are, you know, seemingly clear when it comes to gay sexuality and this kind of thing. I've come to a very different position, and I'll just put it this way. And then I really want to hear you talk, and I'm going to stop talking. But I think we can have a really interesting discussion. Pretend this isn't a podcast. I'm at a very different place, and that is I would describe myself as an atheist who was raised as a Christian and therefore still prays, because I believe in paradox. I don't claim I'm logical, but I have long since given up trying to dress up Christianity and Judaism and make them look like anything that they aren't. And I think they are patriarchal religions at their core, and they have not been misunderstood. Now, if you say the translations were messed with, then fine. But if you say the real tradition, if you go back to the beginning, is much nicer than we think, I don't believe it. And I don't think the present outworking of Christianity, aside from the church you're in, where the church my producer Ernie is in with his pastor husband Rock, it's not that there are no points of light. But to me, the tradition sits very heavily and very consistently as something that is not terribly good. Now I've said my piece, and I want you to tell us what your book is about and argue me out of what I've just said. Correct me.
Well, I'm not going to try to argue you out of what you just said, because there's a rich mine in there that we can talk about. And I am not ever wanting to be a Bible nerd or
Sure.
a theologian myself. I only wanted to get in and find enough that satisfied me that there was an authentic Christianity that wasn't just based on wishful thinking, that I could be a part of, that would teach me something about love.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The religions that grew from a wider culture
Yeah.
that was patriarchal are going to be marked for sure.
Well, you put what you're just saying very well in your book. Again, I forget. I think what's this, page 218? You say, here's my worry. This reconstruction, this reinterpretation, this refreshed Christianity that I've embraced in a marvelous church, parentheses, and there must be any number of other marvelous churches, end parentheses, might stand in the way of deepening some new friendship. So you do sort of get to the fact that in embracing any form of religious faith, you might have also cut yourself off from the people who are, you know, terminally disinclined to ever have anything to do with this again, say they've come out of it, like me, or somebody who looks at it and all they see is, you know, MAGA Trump voters, and they just don't care anymore to have a nicer version explained to them. So how does that sit with you in terms of being part of I don't know how to put this, but not a remnant exactly, because you're not what's left of something, but a new iteration that's not only swimming against the stream of evangelical Christianity, but also swimming against the stream of growing numbers of people who say that they, you know, who fill a box saying none when they're asked what religious affiliation they have, NONE. So just kind of locate yourself for me and your book in that context.
I'm happy to, Frank. I was happy to be a secular humanist. I and an atheist. I but I found I was missing something, or I felt like I was my my personality was judgmental and was narrow in a way. I tend to wanted to um, put away from me any of my heritages that
Mm.
disappointed me. So for a
Yeah,
long time, I didn't want to acknowledge that my ancestry is German because of World War II.
sure. I get that.
I've been disappointed in some things about my American heritage.
Mm.
Obviously, there's some terrible things in the American heritage.
Sure.
Um, and and if that was my tendency to just put away everything that disappointed me,
Mm-mm.
my world was just getting smaller and it
Sure,
was
I understand.
not happier. So, um, what I really sought with this experience of finding a liberal church was a way to make my world wider and happier again.
Mm.
And I say in the end of the book that if I had made these series of discoveries and stopped there and quit and just went on my merry way with League of Women Voters and all the other things I could do with my time, I would be happier for having had the renewed experience. Uh,
Yeah.
as it turns out, I stayed, but um, I wouldn't have had to. And there's actually the United Church of Christ group actually has a church in Canada. I hear whose pastor is a declared atheist. So, and then we had one preacher one Sunday who identifies as a Muslim and a Christian. And all these boundary breakings, I find very helpful just to,
Mm-mm.
we don't feel like we have really hard boundaries of our skin and of our spiritual lives.
Yeah, you get to that in a part of your book. Let's see, where is this page? Something or other, 239, where you say if churches can change, can repair the messes that turn away spiritual seekers, they can take a crucial place in this increasingly elbow to elbow unsettled world. The most difficult lift for some, I have to believe, will concern a way back notion, the one that says there is only one correct religious story, immutable and infallible for all time. This notion is worn threadbare from constant chafing as people have been shoved closer and closer together, but it still retains enough strength to hang many up. And then you go on to some Christian leaders even to entertain discussion or any reinterpretation is to invite things to fall apart utterly. That's kind of my background. That's where my father, Francis Schaeffer, was, to the extent that when one of my brothers-in-law in our nepotistic family ministry, because that's a mark of all the big Christian ministries, is nepotism. Lovely people, but very nepotistic. Sisters bring in husbands, and I was working for my dad when I was a kid, and then later, and then I left, of course. But he started to teach a less inerrant view of scripture and was forbidden from teaching in the ministry while still being a worker, and told that until he would sign off again on a declaration of faith of absolute faithfulness to a total inerrancy of scripture, just to talk shop for a minute, um, that he wouldn't be allowed to teach anymore. So not only do I understand what you've written, and it's well put, by the way, nicely written, but in addition to which, I've watched it actually tear apart pieces of my own family, where my three brothers-in-law, after my dad died and inherited the mantle of the ministry, thank God I was well out of it by then, began to fight with each other, or two of them fought against this more tolerant, lenient person, who, by the way, was the nicest of the three and still is, um, over this issue of inerrancy. And since he wasn't sufficiently faithful anymore, and my goodness, if you talk to him, you'd think he was a straight evangelical, but he had little questions. And there's this idea that if you pull at the fabric at any point, the whole thing will unravel. And that sort of reminds me of writers who are too precious about their work, won't work with an editor, as if somehow their work is divinely inspired. And if you change one thing, it's not my book anymore. And that's not the way good books happen, because you need editors. But um, what's your personal experience in your own life journey of that mentality, that if you tug at this, it's all coming apart? And how did that impact your own thinking that led to this book?
Well, the most obvious thing I can say is my study of sociology, which wasn't accidental. I think I was already I just my exposure in Latin America to Latin American cultures and how different they were from North American cultures
Yeah.
um, was part of my burgeoning interest in
Mm-hmm.
sociology and anthropology. But a sociologist would say um, that circling of the wagons and enforcing of discipline is done when the group is under stress,
Yeah.
and so it's like it's more important at that moment in time to stick together and say the same things,
Sure.
and it's whether or not people believe what they're saying, but they're marking themselves as
Mm-hmm.
I am a member of this group and I'll be a member in good standing. But it becomes just so painful when that harsh boundary um, it ruins lives. There's
Yeah.
so much richness to have in this life, and with those of us with privilege that have tantalizingly in front of us a full life, and yet if we insist on, you know, overprotection of
Mm-hmm.
our group and say they never do anything wrong, we're there's no way we can be happy, and I don't think there's even any way the group can do good for others
Mm-hmm.
if
Yeah,
they're at.
you have an interesting statement of a similar idea to this, where you write in your book, early in the book, I think it's on page 12 or something, or 14. I know there are Christian adherents who don't believe all they are told to believe. I wouldn't have been born if my mother, a religious woman, had accepted a doctrine that consigned unbaptized babies to hell. A man who believed that asked her to marry him. She liked him, but she loved babies deeply, and his beliefs, to use an old theater expression, tore. I love that little anecdote, by the way. Beautiful way to pull people into your book, which it did for me. I wanted to read more. It's like, oh, what's this going to be about? Um, but in any case, talk a little more about that personal family experience and how that translated into her life. Let's go to your mom for a minute here and talk about her, and then what you took away from her personal history and how it's influenced you. Because I just want to set you in your own moment of history. And so let's talk about how you were raised for a bit. I've alluded to my background. Let's talk about yours.
Well, I've thought it was maybe a little bit unusual way to be raised because um, um, my mother and father each had each seemed to have a goal of raising me a different way, and
Mm-hmm.
I was raised to be a good daughter by my mother and sort of hang back a little bit, pick your battles, but speak with conviction when you've got to speak.
Sure.
Um, Stay safe. Watch out for men on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and um, and do your part to take care of your sisters and so forth. All
Mm-hmm.
the good family roles. My dad, on the other hand, was um, more ambitious and wanted a son very badly.
Mm-hmm.
Never got one, got three daughters. Uh, and I was the oldest, and he was just by necessity having to make an exception that his daughter would be the equivalent of the men that he that he knew.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I was sort of raised to be a surrogate son, uh,
Mm,
as well as a good daughter, and it was and so I absorbed some of what he was like, sort of burying any feelings that he didn't feel were worthy of his
mm,
exalted status as a man, and at the same time being sensitive um, to other people's feelings and some of my own from my mother's side. So
mm. Talk a little bit about what your dad was doing, when you were a girl, because that was sort of interesting to me.
oh, let's see.
The work.
For work,
Mm,
he went around and as an outsider audited the books and procedures of various offices of the state of Oregon, and then later federal, the Army.
yeah,
Um,
because some of the military moving around, that involved you as well.
well, we didn't have to move. His job was at his after the Oregon. We He went into the federal system and we moved to Seattle, and he then um, well he in the Tacoma area there was Fort Lewis,
Mhm.
and now McCord Fort Lewis is joint joint together. But anyway,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
um, he he was stationed there when he's in the federal as a civilian for the Army, working for
Hmm.
the Army to do
Sure, as a
auditing.
contractor. Yeah,
So we didn't have to move, but he chafed at his boss and thought he'd get away for a couple of years. So wanted to take a tour of duty and would have loved to go to Hawaii and bring the family, but that was
yeah.
not available. So we went to Panama.
And I remember you talking in the book about the fact that you go into this place and there's no glass in the windows and no air conditioning. And I figured,
Uh,
but I lost track the thread. How old were you when you showed
I,
up in
I,
Panama with no air
we,
conditioning?
Dad went ahead of us by 6 months of the two
Hmm.
years. And then we went in the middle of my ninth grade year.
Yeah.
So my entire sophomore high school year, there was
Hmm.
a high school there that was, international for
Sure.
families like ours. Yes.
And your house or wherever you were living was not as fancy as the officers' quarters that you took a look at. And you finally got to where you're going to be. And it's kind of up on stilts and there's no air conditioning. And I was looking at that through your eyes of child. Ninth grade isn't exactly a child, but it's a period of your life you're not going to forget because you were old enough to really be taking that all in. What were you thinking at that time?
Well, I wasn't really thinking about a status because the friends at the church group were not about status at all.
Sure.
I was thinking about, well, first you have to get used to the climate. If
Hmm.
if you're not going to be living in air conditioning and it's humid and muggy and you start moving slower. But the worst thing about the flimsy housing and the no glass in the windows
Yeah.
was this was an era where they were spraying DDT to keep
Yeah.
down mosquitoes, and just clouds of it, and it was I knew just from my senses, I don't want to breathe this stuff.
That this might not be good for you.
Might not be good for us.
Yeah.
And so I would run around when the trucks came and started. I would run around and close the louvers, which we at least
Hmm.
had the louvers over the screens, and it kept a lot of it out, but it let some of it in, and
Yeah.
that was that scary part. And I have to um, wonder if my sister's early death. She was the youngest of us, the youngest pair of lungs,
Sure.
and played outside a lot.
Yeah.
Whether that played a part.
Yeah. I'm going to jump back into the book here because there's a quote that is very instructive and kind of brings up so many issues and we can get at it. In this new century, it may seem an odd time for any atheist or rote Christian or former Christian or anyone taking a solo path to take a fresh look at the church. Church is part of a waning era. It seems hardly relevant today. Worse, certain American evangelicals have lost themselves in white nationalism, a political cult of the strayed. How else can Christian nationalism be seen when the loudest white evangelical leaders go out of their way to defend powerful men whose crimes have caught up with them, and worse, viciously denigrate victims who have raised their voices? And of course, one of the areas that victims have been most viciously denigrated, unfortunately, but not surprisingly, has been when they talk about the abuse that they suffered within their churches. For instance, I'm just looking at her name here, Krista Brown, who wrote a book called Baptist Land, and who talks about the fact that the Southern Baptists have done everything in their power to waylay, derail, or hide any meaningful investigation into all these pastors that they just kept shuffling around in their churches after they were caught molesting people or whatever it might be. That is one of the things that I think has driven a lot of people away. So I kind of want to get to something in terms of the reason for your book. Let me just reintroduce you here a little bit. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Jean Waight. And Jean has written this book, which I just finished reading this morning, and I'm quoting from a lot here, The River Beyond the Dam, Shooting the Rapids of Progressive Christianity. Given what's happened and the fact that you are on the losing side of a demographic argument because people have voted with their feet and they're just leaving churches and they are emptying. Is this a good thing in the sense of what will be left is better? Can the church start over and build from the ground up with the kind of people you're working with? Or game over, we're going to become secular European country, as it were, like Holland, where there's still some churches, but it's completely a footnote to the rest of the culture?
Well, that's certainly an open question that we're all going to be interested in finding out what happens, because there's so much effect that religion has, even when it goes away, on our
Mm-hmm.
culture. I'm convinced now. But yeah, I'm trying to do a little bit of trend watching myself, and one thought is that the maybe we don't have to defend churches, let them go away and let something new come up to fill the same need.
Mm.
Others are saying, now hold on just a minute. We're seeing an uptick in mainline church attendance all of a sudden, maybe with the pandemic or after, and
Mm-hmm.
started going online, and people saying, going online to your services helped get me through the pandemic. I just feel like it helped me survive.
Yeah.
And others that say, well, Diana Butler Bass has made a tour around the country looking for churches that work
Yeah.
and finding neighborhood on the corner churches that are vibrant and getting more vibrant. So maybe it's maybe it's sort of like the old lava lamp with some blobs going up and some blobs going down
Mm-hmm.
all the time, and you know there's no final answer. But I do think that we don't want to bowl alone, as
Sure.
Putnam said almost a quarter of a century ago.
Yeah.
And when I was working and in Kiwanis, that really didn't do it for me.
Yeah. It
Uh,
wasn't enough of a community.
yeah, there's a lot of attempts at community um, belonging and joining, and
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of them are very good, and but they're I think they're partial. There's it's
Yeah.
I well, that's why I really love talking about canoeing in relationship to church,
Yeah. In the
because
context of the book, which you do.
because um, Bill, my husband, started canoeing, um, And we could recognize that there were some dangers here, and we really didn't want to be doing much of the whitewater work alone. And
Mhm.
we found this. We were in South King County, that is south of Seattle, and we found this paddling group, and they were just completely wonderful in every way. They were welcoming, and they were teaching, and they would
Yeah.
watch people, and they had the methods for um, scouting a river section that we were going to do ahead of time to
Hmm.
know whether
Hmm.
there's a new tree down, or whether um, there's been a change in the riverbed, or whatever was going on, or water's too high. And they were just wonderful, and we felt so lucky. And it's like, no, you really don't want to canoe solo.
Yeah, yeah, you need something. It's interesting because Paul Moreland, who I interviewed, a book called Tomorrow's People and another book called No One Left, is a demographer from the United Kingdom that I listen to on the BBC sometimes when he's interviewed. I interviewed him about his new book, No One Left, and it's basically on demographics and why people aren't having children, and the fact that Japan and South Korea and all these Asian countries, if they don't reverse this, they're going to be literally nations of old people with no one to support them, and so forth and so on. But he brought up a point tangentially that actually has something to do with what you're saying right now. And that is, he says, one of the things people don't want to look at honestly from a scientific point of view, because it doesn't quite fit their model of how progress should be going, is that there's no question that some of the demographic problems in these cultures, not to mention our own, relate to A, the lack of community, that the village, as it were, has gone away, it's been destroyed. And B, that in many instances, that village was based within communities of faith, be they Christian or Islamic or Buddhist or Hindu, or Judaism, whatever it might be. And that as those groups have become more secularized, disparate, and or begun to disappear in local communities, that there's no question that the demographic problems have skyrocketed with that, because people don't have the support. And he makes the same point you do here about, a canoe club or a group of people kayaking together. It's nice. You need to be in a community, but more than that, and this is implied in your book, it's not enough to be part of a community like that without some faith basis that draws you even closer together, gives you a reason maybe for putting up with people you don't like as well, so you don't just walk away but build something. What's interesting is you're saying that, and then Paul Moreland and I have been emailing back and forth about something we're working on, and um, he's saying, we have to face it, and secular academic people have to face the fact that one of the prices we're paying for the lack of the community, the lack of the village, is having a direct demographic impact. And he looks at the state of Israel, for instance, in which the number of children being born to more religiously observant Jews, nothing to do with Judaism or Israel, Palestine. This is just a study. Um, that they are producing much larger families. And of course, I think that's somewhat true in the US. There's a real correlation between a lack of community and a lack of confidence in other areas of life, such as having a family, making a relationship work, whatever it might be. We pay a heavy price for that. And I have to admit that as someone who goes in a more secular direction. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, there's a lot there. Where should we start, Frank?
Wherever you feel like it, it's your book.
Well, because you've gone into the area of demographic distress, and
Sure.
that is something I studied a little in my sociology master's. Um, I mean, but you've also gone into, the lack of community and what part that plays in it. And
Well, and
it
it has a huge impact on family structure, whether it's drug addiction or overdoses or despair or depression. So where the church has gone away, even if you are a secularist who rejoices at that, an honest person has to admit, wait a minute, that vacuum has not been filled, and this is not good.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And actually, that's where I am interested to start on this part of the discussion, Frank,
Mm.
is what do we do how are we taking care of our children, and are we afraid to form families?
Yeah,
Uh, I think there's some really really cool things being said in that area, and I listened to one of your podcasts too. But I also I just one of the cool things I heard years ago was, um, why don't we support the people who are good at having kids and raising kids,
sure.
and not make it a norm that everybody has to do the same thing. And I think that was sort of an aha moment for me. Uh,
Yes.
People have different temperaments, and you don't necessarily want a nervous Nelly mother
Yeah,
taking care of raising kids.
yeah.
And on the other hand, she might make a very great auntie.
Yeah,
Um,
of
and,
course. And you don't want all people to be, sort of feel guilty or they've got to do this. On the other hand, where you really see the rub and where the demographers and the people like Paul have made real studies of this is the number of men and women who do want to have a deep family connection. They do want children, but the way we've structured our culture in terms of always putting higher education, jobs, X amount of money in the bank, all this fancy stuff you've got to do before you even do any of the what used to be considered just ordinary human living. The lack of support is massive. So I'm not talking about going to the people who have really made up their mind. Here's how I want to live. Here's what I don't want to do. This isn't for me. Of course, fine, great. We'll help you do that or not do that. But it's interesting when you do these happiness and life satisfaction studies that one of the huge areas in which people are desperately not pleased with how their lives have gone is the fact that they're not making the connections they wanted. And starting right with the dating scene, you have all these Gen Z kids now who are done with it and then saying, the hell with this. It's not working. I hate it. I'm not going to date anymore at all because the whole thing was booby trapped by the algorithms. It's dehumanizing. Count me out. They're not even getting to the first step of a process of putting together a lifetime of connection when it comes to just romantic relationships. That's kind of new. I mean, this is not a problem the human race has suffered from before, is a lack of an ability to connect with people, even on a romantic level.
Oh, absolutely, Frank. And I agree that whenever a group of young people give up on something, it's it's a cry of pain in a
Yeah,
way,
yeah,
as well as being an accurate reflection of what times they're living in. I do think that whenever we have a problem and we recognize it, a response does come in time, and you look at
sure.
a snapshot and it looks dire, and then something else will come because it looks dire to a lot of people. uh,
Yeah.
then some things start happening differently. And
Mm,
one of the just parts of this, you mentioned the structure of families is really hard for a lot of people to deal with. When
sure.
if a job demands 12 hours a day from you, but that's what you've trained for, and
Yeah.
then what do your kids get from you? And then you start not eating together at dinner, and everything starts falling apart, and everybody is front of their own device, and which
Yeah.
isn't good. Because I don't think that electronics is the way to learn empathy.
No, not at all. And
But when
sometimes you don't, you're not
and
getting what you thought you were bargaining for.
so let's go beneath the surface and go down to something that we've assumed was the normal for decades and
Sure.
centuries. And that's the nuclear family.
Mm,
Nuclear family doesn't work anymore. It puts too much pressure. Um, well, anthropologists have been weighing in on this topic, and
yeah.
compared with our ape cousins, our offspring do not do not mature very fast, and they
Yeah.
require many years of care, and it's too much on the mother,
Yeah.
And so obviously it's important to that the fathers be engaged. But
Absolutely.
it's even too much for the nuclear family, and
Yeah,
so extended families become important, and and aunts and uncles become
sure.
important, and that's there's an anthropologist, Hurdy. Let's see, Sarah
Yeah.
Schaeffer Hurdy. That
Yes, yeah. Who
this,
writes about this and just has a new book out on it called
oh,
Fathers, or What Are Fathers, not What Are Fathers For? I'm just trying to remember the book title. But yeah, in fact, we're trying to
yeah,
book her.
she had an essay years ago.
Yeah,
She was concerned with how she was seeing a trend that if we go like this, we're going to get really in trouble with empathy. We're going to have
yeah,
few
absolutely.
people with empathy, and
Mm,
she was saying how humans got this far was we shared childcare duties.
absolutely.
We gave the mother a break to recover. Um, we well, aunts and uncles, for instance, can um, reinforce the success of their own genes
Yeah.
by helping nieces and nephews. It's
Yeah, and if you look at the hunter-gatherer model that we all come from, in a book I talk a lot about called The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who lived with the San Bush people in the Kalahari in the 1950s for a couple of years off and on with her parents. They were into shared child care. They were into the idea of the village raising the children. The nuclear family was something that wouldn't have even occurred to them because the whole community was taking care of the kids. I want to change gears here for a minute and get very personal, but you went there in your book, so I don't feel like I'm talking about things you don't want to talk about. You have a very interesting passage, beautifully written, by the way, and I'm going to begin it at a weird place. It just says, but perversely, comma, Handel's joyful bars suddenly gave way to Mozart's ominous chords of Requiem. Fear rose viscerally, almost a panic. Good description, by the way, of the ominous chords there. It's one of my favorite bits of music, and I just love how you described it. Like a mirage, a shapeless shimmer of memory rose up, clarified, and transported me to my disastrous first marriage. And because your book is about your personal journey, you go there, and I do too, wish to too, if you don't mind for a minute, because I just think it's so important in understanding who you are. Um, and Sarah's book, by the way, is called Father Time, A Natural History of Men and Babies. And I just finished reading it a few weeks ago. So I can't run for president anymore because I forget names, uh, as somebody else who's just dropped out. Um, but anyway, I want to go to that personal anecdote, and I love the way you bring it in with a piece of music changing the mood. I mean, what a wonderful observation of just the way our brains work, and how beautiful that you would use that. But talk to me a little bit about that, and then your own personal journey and your own personal history, aside from these ideas, um, and just how all that worked and didn't work, because I'm sure that that obviously influences how you look at the world, and why you're not a big fan of the patriarchy, as I am not either. So go there a little bit.
Okay, well, starting with the juxtaposition of here I was really happy with what the preacher had just been talking about, and it was like, oh yes, it's not one of those um, crummy Bible stories that I always hated, and
Sure.
he put a new interpretation, and I was like, I'm really happy to be here listening to this.
Mm,
And that's the perverse time that when you're feeling good, that
mm,
something nasty can come up from the
absolutely.
woodshed. And yes, so it did. And even though it had been, um, I'd already been into my second marriage for 20 years. Um, I could still be afraid of what went on in this first marriage to a man who it became clear what had growing mental illness, because he was he didn't have a mean bone in his body. He was a pacifist. we dropped out of college to find ourselves,
Mhm.
and but uh, that's another case where um, our the mental illness is it's really funny that you have um, it mimics some things in our culture, like
Sure.
in extreme form, so that the desire we have to control our situation
Yeah.
to so that we don't drown, um, it shows up in mental illness where and in control of others in your domestic situation.
Yeah.
And I think personally the psychologists haven't quite gotten kind of figured out that there's
Yeah.
a component to mental illness. But at any rate, um,
Yeah, I love that idea that it kind of begins to mirror image larger issues in the culture. It isn't just all about that person. I think that's so true. I don't know why I think that's so true, but it feels completely right to me.
yeah, there we've well, it's our culture has become just completely enthralled with individualism, and
Hmm.
we are just free atoms, and that's wonderful and all this. And so all we need whenever we need something is to buy a self-help book, and we'll
Yeah.
figure it out and do something different, do something better, and improve ourselves. But it's really not that simple.
Yeah.
So yes, the key, it's incredible now to think about the fact that I stayed in that first marriage for 10 years. Of course, I started before we got married before I turned 19. I was
Mm.
18. Um, and but the situation works on you and you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know what to do.
Sure.
You get sort of mentally beat down to where
Mm.
you're defeated, um, and of course in the early years of uh, in our work world,
Mm.
there are crummy jobs for young people,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so it's like what am I going to do? So it was 10 years during which I sort of uh, had more depression than I want for a
Than you
lifetime.
wanted to handle from yourself and from your husband. Let me sort of wind this up by telling people that this is a really good book. And I say that as someone who doesn't agree with a lot of it in the general sense that I've left the church, but uh, in all honesty, you pay a price because now you're outside of a community environment. You're seeking community in other ways, your rowing club, whatever it may be. It doesn't work out all that well. There's something inherent about needing shape to life that not only has a spiritual component, but other parts to it. So I'm very glad you've written your book because it kind of uh, made me think and made me stop and say, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that gets thrown away when you walk away from something like that. And if your experience has been bad, I like the courage of Jean in saying, okay, yeah, this didn't work out, but I'm going to try again. And then seeking something that worked. So I just, my hat's off to you. I respect your strength. I respect your ability to just keep searching and looking. And I'm so glad you found something that is speaking to you and caring for you. So I really recommend this book. And it's a good book. And the title again is The River Beyond the Dam: Shooting the Rapids of Progressive Christianity. We've been talking on In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I would ask you to subscribe to it on Apple Podcasts and also listen to my Substack commentaries called It Has to Be Said at frankschaeffer.substack.com, and maybe do us a favor and subscribe to that. But this has been a really good conversation. What did I not ask you about the book or yourself or life in general or the State of the Union or the universe that you would like to address. And we'll go there and give you the last word.
Oh, thank you, Frank, and thank you for your kind words. And yes, I wrote this book because I couldn't find anything like it.
Mm,
There's a lot of liberal pastors who have been ahead of their congregations and they've written
sure.
fabulous books. But when I was out of the church, I would not, for the life of me, have picked up any of these. And
Yeah.
I just thought as I go into green, um, the whole climate disaster situation we're in, I think we need all the allies we can find,
Yeah.
and I think if we shut off um, the possibility that there might be allies in unexpected places like
Mm,
churches, then well, we just really need to have all hands on deck,
mm.
not make assumptions about um, the mentality of another group over here.
Yeah, well, you achieved that. You make a good case, and it's a beautifully written book, and something of your own character comes through, which is an asset. Because as Ernie, my producer, said to me when we were discussing this, he said, "Yeah, Jean's a really nice person. You're gonna like her." He was right.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking with Ernie too. He's very welcoming.
Yeah, Ernie's great. So, Jean, all the best with your book. Stay in touch with Ernie and I. If there are other people you think we should interview, please tell us, and keep in touch with us so we know how this is all going for you.
Thank you so much, Frank. I shall do that.
Real pleasure. Thanks a lot. Talk to
Thank
you,
you.
Jean. Bye bye.